Is The Guns of Navarone my favorite movie of all time? No, of course not. It's far too clunky for that. So why talk about it? Well, clunkiness aside, it's still a good movie. Released in 1961, it feels more like a 50s movie, the decade when Hollywood went widescreen and international. It lumbers along like other 50s epics, like Ben-Hur and North by Northwest. I'd add Rio Bravo to that list, but that movie tends to mosey rather than lumber. It's also one of those movies that's actually better than the book written by Alistair MacLean. In the book, the description of the guns is given a paltry page and a half, but writer-producer Carl Foreman and director J. Lee Thompson do not disappoint. They give you your gun's worth with a spectacular gun cave set that dominates the film's fiery climax. Now, most young men entering adolescence sooner or later run into the works of Alistair MacLean, who was perhaps the king of boys' adventure novels. His novels feature elaborate plots, either in a wartime or espionage setting. His writing style tends to run-on sentences and chaste characterizations that imbue both the hero and villain with a heroic sense of gallantry. Many of Alistair MacLean's novels have been turned into films over the years, but The Guns of Navarone still remains the big one. There are two others that I'll talk about in later videos, and if you're a fan of such things, you won't have any trouble guessing which ones they are. I was 8 years old when this movie was first released, and as we lived miles from the theater, going to the movies was a semi-rare event. As a consequence, we missed some of the big ones like this and The Great Escape, movies that all my classmates who lived closer to the theater got to see and would rave about in the schoolyard come Monday. Instead, we wound up seeing things like Sergeants 3, a Rat Pack version of Gunga Din, or Duel of the Titans, starring Steve Hercules Reeves and Gordon Tarzan Scott. So I didn't get to see this movie until it came on television years later, and back then that was still black and white and pan and scan. Strangely, in the early 70s, when I was programming films at a local community center, I rented The Guns of Navarone from a Hollywood distributor. But while in color, it was still pan and scan. And that's important, because one of the things that this film does very well is the use of widescreen. And what the widescreen reveals is how director J. Lee Thompson blocks the actors in groups, creating a sense of a team. And that aspect surprised me, because I never got to see that in all the earlier versions. As for the actors, it's Hollywood heavyweights on parade. Gregory Peck, Anthony Quinn, David Niven top-lining, and they're abetted by a dour Stanley Baker, a square Anthony Quayle, and teen heartthrob James Darren. There's also the beautiful Gia Scala and the Greek powerhouse Irene Pappas. Oh yes, and a young Richard Harris has an early cameo. The Second World War was still fresh in many people's minds, and the studios were a bit nervous about setting an adventure film in that era. Up until then, most war movies were very serious affairs. Producer Carl Foreman was able to straddle that hurdle with his earlier The Bridge on the River Kwai, and he works hard to inject this movie with some of the same moral quandaries. And that is what separates this movie from all other MacLean adaptations. A few short years later, younger audiences would prefer the more action-heavy Where Eagles Dare. And while The Guns of Navarone may seem corny and quaint in comparison to that blockbuster, it still retains its status as the best of all MacLean adaptations. It was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, but only one for its special effects. The practical effects, such as explosions and the tank used for the sinking of the fishing boat, are very well done. I do like the use of maps and animated title cards. It connects the film to its pulpy paperback origins. But blue matte lines are sporadically visible throughout the storm sequence. That was a common problem back in those days. During the climbing sequence, Miniatures and glass shots are used to good effect. Now, when you're a kid, you don't know from miniatures and glass shots, but little by little, you begin to spot how the movie makers pull off their tricks. As Gregory Peck inches his way up that slanted rock face, he is pelted by studio rain, and the stormy sea is projected behind him. It does not look realistic at all, but it sure looks like fun. I thought, what fun it must be to be an actor, to get to do things like that. But alas, that seems to have been a bridge too far. See you around the campus.